Welcome back to Scaling Theory. In this episode, I speak with Matthew O. Jackson, the William Eberle Professor of Economics at Stanford University and an external faculty member at the Santa Fe Institutje. Matt is one of the founders of the modern economics of networks. His books include The Human Network and Social and Economics Networks, and his work spans network formation, learning, financial contagion, inequality, and more recently, the behavior of AI agents. The conversation runs in two parts. The first one on the scaling of human networks. We discuss the friendship paradox and its consequences for adolescent behavior and policy design. We turn to the result that homophily slows how fast a society learns the truth. We then discuss the gossip study when villagers in southern India proved remarkably good at naming the most central spreaders in the network. The second part turns to AI agents as a different species. We discuss his recent manifesto on AI behavioral science. We talk about the Turing test on LLM, the flexibility of agent personas through system prompts, and what we make of Moltbook, the social network for AI agents. We close on whether the Santa Fe and Stanford economics are converging. By the end of the conversation, you will know about why telling students how much their peer drinks actually change their behavior more than warning them about the dangers of alcohol. Why the same network can spread a virus quickly and a belief slowly, and why AI agents change their behavior when asked to explain it. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's great to finally have a chance to have a conversation with you after reading so many of your papers and books. So what I've done is that I've divided the questions in two different parts. First, I want to talk about something more or less related to the scaling of human networks. And then in part two, which I find is an interest of you, which is also an interest of many of the listeners, I'd like to talk about the scaling of AI agents. But to start with the scaling of human networks, most of us, I guess, think of life as a story of individual choices, right? So I study, I work, I marry or not, I have kids or not, I succeed, I fail. It's a mixture of a bit of everything. But in The Human Network, a book you published, you showed that the invisible map around us, meaning friends, colleagues, classmates, neighbors, and on, actually shapes what we believe, what we know, and the opportunities that reach us. So I guess the question is this: what is the simplest everyday example of a network that is indeed quietly changing someone's life? And I have to say, this is definitely a very interesting question. Being the dad of a very young boy, that's a question I've been asking actually on the podcast. What would it mean to raise my kids in a complexity-friendly way, right? So maybe explaining why I'm asking this question first.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think, we do realize we're very social animals, and that, social interactions are what allows humans to specialize and to be more productive than we would be if we were each, acting on our own. And the influence, I think, one example of the way that things influence us that we're not quite aware of is what sociologists have termed the friendship paradox. And the friendship paradox is a scaling property. And it refers to the fact that, we have a bias in what we see in our networks. And we can talk about a number of different biases as we go through today. But, a very simple one is the following. And this is something that happens even outside of networks. Imagine you're standing in a line at the airport. You're sitting there and there's 1,000 people in the line. And you're thinking that it's always crowded. But you could think sometimes the line has 1,000 people and sometimes it has 10 people. And now you ask, which line are you more likely to be in? You're more likely to be in the line that has 1,000 people than the line that has 10 people. You're 100 times more likely to be in that line. And if you don't adjust for the fact that sometimes the line has 1,000 people and sometimes it has 10 and you're more likely to be in that 1,000. If I ask you how crowded is the line on average, you're going to say it's always 1,000 people because that's what you experience. And that plays out in our social networks as well, in the way of what's this friendship paradox, that the people we're friends with tend to be much more popular than typical people in the society, or the people that we're not friends with. So, if somebody has 100 friends and somebody else has 10 friends, I'm much more likely to be a friend of the person that I'm 10 times more likely to be a friend of the person that has 100 friends. And so that's something that people have recognized for a while. But as humans, we don't necessarily acknowledge that and understand that. And where does it actually impact our lives? I started reading up on adolescent behavior a while back. There's Thomas Valente and others, Tucker. There's a series of papers that look at how adolescents behave. People who are more connected in a network tend, for instance, I think Tom Valente found somebody who has one more friend as an adolescent is 5% more likely to have smoked at a given age. They're 6% more likely to have tried alcohol. So that tells you that the more connected people with more friends are behaving differently than typical people in the population. They're more likely to have tried certain kinds of behaviors than others. And so if you're an adolescent and you're just looking around, and this becomes even a stronger effect now with social media, but maybe you're following somebody who has lots and lots of friends. If they're behaving systematically differently, and then you perceive that that's the normal behavior, you end up having an incorrect behavior estimate of what the population's doing. So you think everybody's smoking or everybody's trying alcohol, but that's because you went to a party and you saw all the people that go to parties and they're more likely to be doing this. And so these kinds of interactions end up distorting people's perspectives. And that's something that we don't realize, and it ends up changing our belief in what's normal behavior in a society. And it has consequences. So I trace this out in a paper that then shows that leads to amplification of the behavior, because then kids tend to think it's normal, they tend to do it, and then you get a feedback effect because of the network. So, networks can have subtle but powerful implications.
So I guess a follow-up question is, so now that we know that, what should we make out of it? Because as you mentioned, indeed, having a network means more friends, maybe easier to find a job, but also more likely to smoke, right? So good and bad outcomes. So is there something we should make out of it, or should we just acknowledge that it exists and not necessarily try to network, right, one way or the other?
I think, certainly as an economist, part of the reason I got interested in this is that to the extent that this has first order effects on people's behaviors, and if we have a policy that's trying to get kids to not try drugs or not smoke, or to have certain kinds of behaviors, then if we don't realize that they're part of this social network and their social media is impacting their belief of what's normal behavior, then it's going to be a problem for us to try and address these behaviors. And that plays out in a whole series of different settings. It's, whether we're trying to get people to invest more in education, or to go to university, or to understand how job markets are working, and to be able to get opportunities to get employed in different places. The networks constrain these things. And if we don't take that into account and we just throw financial money at things, it's not necessarily going to be a useful policy. So I think, understanding these things can change things in ways that we wouldn't be able to engineer otherwise.
How far should you push it, right? So let's take the smoking example. So I could see the slippery slope of saying, well, in order for them not to smoke, the ideal solution is for teenagers not to have any friends and to stay home all the time, right? So you see where I'm coming from. Can we really engineer something, or because it's complex, should we just say we just have to accept that this is the outcome of having friends?
No, I think it does mean that. So I'll give you one example. So there was a university, an Illinois university in Illinois, and they had a problem where their students were binge drinking, so drinking excessive amounts of alcohol, much too much. And so they did a bunch of surveys, and the surveys found that people's perceptions were more than between 50 and 100% wrong in terms of how much of this activity was going on. So the students over-perceived it and thought it was normal and acceptable behavior. And so, they tried all kinds of things like advertising abstention, advertising alcohol's dangerous for you in excess, and so forth. And eventually they found what really worked was they just had a policy of showing what the actual survey was of how many students were doing this. And just by showing how many students were doing it, the number of students doing it actually reduced. So that policy, then just advertising to people, just making people aware, look, this isn't normal behavior. It's actually about 40% of the population. It's not 70%, which most of you think it is. It's 40% of the population. And then it reduced down to below 30%. So the fact that people suddenly thought, oh, not everybody's doing this, the majority don't, then it actually reduced the behavior. So this is a kind of thing, where just making people aware of something can actually have a positive impact.
Yeah. All right. I want to talk about that actually. So you have a paper with Dunia Lopez Pintado in which you show that homophily, so the preference for people like us, can actually help small ideas catch fire because they spread inside a very tight group with common interests. But in another paper published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics with Ben Golub, you actually showed that the same homophily slows down how fast a society can actually learn the truth. Yeah. So I guess we come back to this idea of positive and negative features, right? So can you tell more about the mechanism underlining this idea?
Yeah, sure. And I think the two examples you come up with are very interesting. And in fact, the stuff with Dunya compared to Ben, part of it is that the way that the network shape plays out depends on what we're talking about. So what kind of process is actually taking place on the network? If you think about one example would be that, the one with Dunya, you could think of simple contagion. And, if you look at COVID, for instance, homophily did not slow COVID down. So the fact that there's different countries and different locations, it still spread worldwide within a few weeks of the first cases. So something like very simple contagion where all you need is an interaction to spark something from going from one to another, then it's easy to have homophily not matter much other than incubating things at the beginning. So in the case with Dunya, you have a dense enough part of a network that can get things going, and then things can spread from there. And even if the rest of the network is sparse, the fact that there's still connections and random interactions across the network allows something to spread. In the work with Ben, we were looking at a very different kind of phenomenon. So rather than thinking about a contagion process, think about your opinion on some topic where you have relative forces. You're hearing things from media, you're hearing things from friends, you've got different amounts of content that is coming at you with different opinions. And to some extent, in that model, you're just averaging things. So you're sort of averaging the information that's coming from different forces around you. And in that model, then different groups can end up reinforcing themselves and reinforcing their beliefs. And that relative pressure is very different than just having, it only takes one to infect me, but it takes 100 to convince me of some new idea or that of some particular opinion, belief, etc. So the different forces play out very differently. And I think that's sort of an interesting theme that comes up in networks, is that the same network shape and geometry can end up having very different impacts depending on what kind of scaling process we're talking about. Is it just a disease contagion? Is it reinforcement learning based, where people need to be impacted a number of times? They play out very differently on the same networks.
So that leads me to ask a very big question. Same network may be powering the spreading of disease and information at different speeds. So is my understanding correct that you do not believe that there is actually a general law of network that could explain it all?
Yeah, I think that a general law would be a bit of too much of a caricature, in the sense that what we do see is different processes have very different outcomes on exactly the same environments. And I think, it's possible to have laws that we'll end up with, but it'll be a list of, okay, under this kind of circumstances and these kinds of processes, then you can expect fast spreading. under these kinds of processes, you can expect splits and polarization. And we see both of those in the world, right? We saw COVID spreading widely at the same time that people's beliefs about COVID were polarizing, right? So you saw the same networks affecting the populations on two different evolving processes in very different ways. And so I think it's, the hope of having one law explain both of those phenomena is probably, too much. But having two laws isn't a bad idea, right? So, we can probably still simplify a lot, but a single law that's going to explain all of it, I think is too much to hope for.
Yeah, two laws for one very same network, right? The human population in case of COVID.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe there is actually something to be studied when it comes to the interaction between those two laws, whether the speed at which COVID spreads actually has an impact on the slowness by which people believe that this is true, right?
Yes,
And
yeah.
outside my comfort zone. But so to come back to one of your publication and to make it very specific. So you have another one, actually some papers about gossip, which I think is a fantastic word to talk about an actually very serious mechanism, right? Despite the fact that we may associate it with, some press that we don't necessarily see with the highest regard. So you have a paper called using gossips to spread information, in which you show that you can actually identify the most influential people in a village by just asking other villagers who is good at spreading the news. And in a sense, this is very different from the idea we may have of how to spread the news, because you do say, well, this is not necessarily about the leaders of a network such as they may be identified, but it may be that actually someone you do not see as being the leader of a group is the person you would need to touch to be able to spread the news. So again, can you tell us more about the mechanisms and the research you've done in the space?
Sure. So, there's many situations where we're interested in, finding influencers in some setting. The word has taken on a new meaning with social media platforms, and there, you basically can look, and if somebody has 100 million followers, then it's pretty easy to think that they're going to be influential. But in a lot of settings where things are spreading by word of mouth, things are much more subtle. And we were interested. We had done a bunch of studies. This is with Abhijit Banerjee, Arun Chandrasekhar, and Esther Duflo. We had been looking at the spread of microfinance in small rural villages in southern India. And we were working with a phone company to give away phones. So we were doing different things and trying to figure out, how do you identify the people who are going to be most influential and best for spreading information via word of mouth? And it was clear, we'd mapped out networks, and it was clear that network position was very important. But it's very expensive to go in a lot of settings and collect network information. So, actually mapping out a human network is tricky, and finding the right one that matters is also hard. So we thought, well, could we just ask people? Would they have the information, and would they be able to tell us easily? And there's reasons you would expect that wouldn't work. And the reasons you'd expect that wouldn't work is that there's a bunch of research, probably by David Krakauer is the most famous in this area, showing that people actually aren't that aware of their network around them. But you can name your friends. Often, just even naming which of your friends are actually close friends with each other, people get wrong sometimes. Naming friends of friends that aren't your friends is tricky. And then once you go out past two, the network just looks like this just opaque mass that you have no idea what's going on. But people's cognitive maps of their own social networks are not so extensive and full of errors.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, maybe that probably means that they're not going to be able to name somebody who's central unless it happens to be their best friend. And it turned out that they were remarkably good at doing it. I mean, really good. And the reason that we explain this phenomenon is that you don't actually have to know much about the network, but if you're hearing that so-and-so said something repeatedly, this is the gossip part, right? So I'm hearing gossip, and if I hear somebody's name repeatedly who's not my friend, then I begin to believe that they're central in the network, and they turn out to be central in the network. So people I'm going to be hearing more about are going to be people who I can be connected to more easily. People who are more peripheral or isolated are people I'm not going to hear about much. And so just using that simple principle, they're able to name people. And moreover, they're able to name people who did better at spreading than our network theory would have predicted. So then we did an experiment where we used them to try and give information out about a lottery to give away phones. And they turned out the people they named did better than their network position would have predicted. So it turns out people both can name central people for an explainable reason and seem to be naming people who are even better than just the network would suggest.
Yeah. To come back to just for a second on the idea that indeed you would expect people being bad at identifying who's an influencer. I was just last weekend in London and I've seen a friend I haven't seen in 4 years. And so, we did what you do, like, oh, what about this person? And, do you have any news to share? And I was so surprised to realize that he knew many people when we lived in Paris, both of us, that I was not even aware or did not remember that they were actually friends. So that was kind of a shocking, realization that those two were connected, whereas in my mind, they've never met each other. But let me ask a question, which will be the end of the part one of the conversation. Do you also find that those influencers could actually be, let's say, very good at spreading information that is real, true, and not necessarily that good or not to the same degree when it comes to spreading misinformation, right? Or do you see that, no, the network, once it is formed, will actually spread those mis and information in similar fashion?
Yes. So I think there's a couple of comments to make on this. So there's two aspects to that question which are important and I think probably underappreciated. One is that people have different propensities, natural propensities to spread different kinds of information. And we actually found that in this study where we looked at people who had high positions inside these villages. So if they were a politician or an elder that had sort of a lot of respect, they were less likely to spread news about this free cell phone lottery giveaway. And one explanation for that, even though they were highly central, was that, it wasn't something they wanted to be associated with. Was, okay, there's this external group coming in, they're giving away phones. Doesn't sound like something I want to be advertising. So there's some personal aspect to, is this something I would like to be spreading, or is that something somebody else should be spreading? And so each person might have some area of expertise, some reputation, and so that'll affect what kinds of things they're willing to talk about and what they're not. And the other thing that's interesting is that the networks that we use are actually different for different purposes. So actually a nice study I was part of where we looked at Stanford students, Sylvia Morelli, Jamil Zaki. So we were looking at Stanford undergraduates. And if you ask them a question, who makes you feel good or who you hang out with, who's your fun friends, you get one network. If you ask, who do you share information about when you need advice or you've had some kind of problem, you sort of really need somebody, a shoulder to lean on, that's a different network. And the people who are central in one of those networks are not the same people who are central in the other network. And so it says that, you could have friends, but which ones you would activate and who's central and which kind of information flow can be very different depending on what's, you're actually spreading.
Yeah, so you end up with different networks here for different purposes.
Exactly.
Let's move on to part two of the conversations. Mainly, I want to talk about the scaling of AI agents. So looking at those agents as the different species. But to ease us into the second part of the conversation, I thought I will try to bridge the first part about humans and then those AI agents by asking about what AI is doing to us human. So you have a paper, and actually many as we discussed, in which you look at this phenomenon by which we actually tend to pair with people who resemble us to some extent. And in one paper called Inequalities, Economic and Social Roots, you actually dig deep into this idea that a big chunk of inequality is not really about talent, it's not really about taxes, but it's about who you know. Now, we've discussed that. We tend to befriend people like ourselves. And so we could see how this could also scale inequality by benefiting from a positive network or a less positive network. My question on AI is this. Do you think that AI is actually sorting us into even finer bubbles and will therefore accelerate the phenomenon that you have observed in this paper? Or on the contrary, do you think that AI is actually putting us toward more the center and is kind of equalizing, in a sense, the networks, because we tend to see the same information when we use ChatGPT and Claude? I refer here to a paper published in the FT just last week that tend to show that this might be the case. So what is that doing to the paper again on inequalities in networks?
Yes. So I think, there are competing forces. And as you're pointing out, on the one hand, there is an aspect for it to be getting, useful information out broadly and maybe the same information out to many people. So on the one hand, having access to AI means that there's a bunch of people who might not have had access to information that now they have access to. So to some extent, it can, if you needed to rely on some central individual for knowledge, your local wisdom, that person's power and grip and importance is to some extent diminished by the presence of AI. So on one hand, it sort of levels the playing field. And on the other hand, it does allow us, and I think, let's sort of differentiate AI. AI has been around for quite a while and underlies a lot of platforms. And, the LLMs are sort of a new instantiation of AI, but we've been working through, I guess, how would you put it, algorithmically or computer assisted systems for communication for a long time. And in fact, even, if you just go back, even the telegraph or, telephones were ways of communicating and helping people communicate over longer distances and making things more even, but at the same time, allowing you to stick and find people who are similar to yourselves. So I think that second natural tendency of humans does give us this kind of paradox where we become more connected than ever, but at the same time, more divided than ever. And, that plays out differently again, as this ties back to what we started at the beginning. The more connected than ever allows simple things to spread more quickly, but allows things that need reinforcement to spread more slowly. And so I think that we'll have both of those different forces happening at the same time, where we can get contagion and viral contagion of different kinds of ideas, but at the same time, different communities coming to different conclusions because of this reinforcement and increased separations inside their circles. So it's a fascinating time. And I think, AI is just accelerating this natural tendency that we have.
Yeah. I guess this leads us to discuss actually indeed AI system and how they behave. Because depending, of course, on how you design and shape AI, this will also have different impacts on our human networks. So you co-authored a kind of a manifesto called AI Behavioral Science with a who's who of behavioral and computer scientists, including most of the prominent scientists in the space, including someone who I happen to know, Eric Brynjolfsson from Stanford, and many others. I'll put the link in the show notes for everyone to read. Now, the premise is this. AI agents have their own behavioral subjects. So they have their own biases, their own tendencies, almost personalities, which is something we've all sensed now, right? If you use different AI system, you would see that they do not react the same. So should we expect that when it comes to interactions between those AI agents, that we will be able to observe crowd phenomena, panics, fashion cycle going at machine speed? And if so, is there a way to measure that to try to anticipate what indeed it will do on our human networks?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a very important problem. Part of the reason for writing that paper, we had a conference last year and we had a lot of discussions, and it became clear that as behavioral and social scientists, people studying networks, people studying psychology, people studying game theory, we have a whole series of tools that have been developed for understanding human behaviors and understanding complex systems of interacting humans. And so a lot of that methodology can be applied now to systems where instead of the human being the subject that we're studying, an AI agent or systems of AI interacting agents are what we're going to be studying. And then human AI interacting systems will be studying as well. And so this gives us a whole series of tools which are already well used and understood to begin to deploy to understanding this. And I think, as you're pointing out, it's important because AIs do exhibit different features, different personalities, and they're hard to predict in the sense that even if you could read the code, so a lot of it's proprietary, you're not going to be able to read the code. And then you can't see all the data that it's been trained on. We can't comprehend all of the data it's been trained on, and that's part of its power. So it's very difficult to predict how it's going to behave just from knowing how it's structured and what it's learned. So the only way we can actually predict its behavior is by putting it through tests and seeing how it behaves in different situations. And we're used to using laboratory games and empirical observations to evaluate behaviors. And so this sort of says, yeah, let's use a lot of the tools that we already have to do Turing tests and to do other kinds of tests where we can test AI and see when is it altruistic, when is it, fair, when is it selfish, does it amplify human tendencies or does it mitigate them? Under what circumstances does it do it one versus the other? So I think it's a really important arena right now, and one that I think we have a lot of power to begin to assess AI.
Let me ask two follow-up questions on that. One that is scientific, the other one clearly not. I'll start with the scientific question. What do you make of this idea that AI systems are aware, quote unquote, that they are being observed and therefore could actually adapt behavior, right? Because it seems that this has always been true for every subject, but maybe even more so with AI. So is it affecting our ability to observe and just deploy the tools that we've been using for a long time? The non-scientific question is this. Have you personally been trying to observe Moltbook? This is the social network for AI agents. And if so, what was your reaction? Again, not a scientific reaction, right? Sure. What do you make out of it?
Yeah. So on the first one, in terms of AI reacting to being observed, we noticed in some of our Turing tests that we gave AI, if you ask it to give an explanation for its actions and not just choose an action, it will choose a different action and one for which it can give a coherent explanation. And that I found surprising. It's not obvious why it's happening because it's like these are simple LLMs, so it's not obvious why they would be doing that, but it is a human tendency. So if you ask people to make a choice and then before they make their choice, you say, and please explain it to me, and they think through things differently and they follow a different chain of thought. And then that what they come out with is different. And so the fact that AI is doing this means that, maybe it's not aware that it's being observed in the same awareness that we usually think of as human consciousness, but somehow the fact that you're asking it about that means that it's reacting in a different way. And that's hard to understand. Not obvious from the description of the programming and what it's been trained on why it would be doing that, but it does do that. And another thing we found was when you have people play games, there's an interesting phenomenon. So imagine there's a game with two roles. So one game is a trust game. I give you some money, and then you can either keep it all or you can give some back to me. And whatever you get back to me is triple. So it's valuable for me to give you money because you can give me back much more than I started with, but you can keep it all too. And so that's called a trust game. And often when you have people play this game, if they've played both roles, they understand the game better than if they've just played one side. And so they behave differently after they've had experience in both roles than if they haven't. We had AI do the same thing, and it played systematically differently after it had played one role in the other role. So that shows some kind of learning off of small amounts of data, not just its training set and so forth, or at least reaction. I'm not sure learning is the right word, but there's somehow that AI is reacting to these situations and what it's perceiving in ways that we wouldn't have expected. And so that means that observing it could be making it a change in its behavior, right? This is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle playing out in AI in some way.
Yeah, clearly. So what about Moltbook?
Yeah, Moltbook, just like everybody else, I was just dumbfounded by it. It's so science fiction-esque, and it's very unexpected. It means that these agents that we're creating are much richer entities than we ever expected. And what you see coming out of it is both, in some cases, really astounding in its depth and the level of conversations, and then others are very silly. And so there's, at least the excerpts you see from various sources, it seems that both things are going on. There's very deep conversations and very shallow ones. Maybe that's the same on Reddit, right? So
Yeah.
Moltbook's basically a Reddit for AI agents. So maybe they'll be like humans, where they'll have some very deep philosophical conversations that we never would have expected them to have, and then they'll also have very shallow, peculiar ones that that are strange in different ways.
Yeah, I was about to say, indeed, some of those AI agents came up with a new philosophy, right? So this was one of the striking example of how oppressive this could be. But so let's talk about their evolution. And by their, I mean AI agents. So in the paper, you've been mentioning quite a few times on the Turing tests, where you actually put AI chatbots to classic economic games. You ask a very simple question: do they play those games like us being here, humans? And the result, I thought, was subtle and maybe even a little spooky, but I will give you the pleasure of unveiling what you indeed find. My question is this: as the models get bigger, do they become more diverse, more human-like, or do they, on the contrary, all converge toward like a single personality, a single kind of agents? So I guess my question in a sense is whether there is one personality waiting at the top of the scaling curve when it comes to AI agents.
Yeah. I think, so as you're pointing out, when you look at these, they tend often to play as a human. So their behavior is more monolithic than a human would be. And that's often because essentially we're playing with one subject, right? So if we put one human through these tests, they would tend to play the same thing over and over in different, there'd be predictable across games and even within games. And we see that on the AI agents, and they tend to deviate. In some cases, they deviate from human play. They often tend to be a little bit more altruistic, a little bit more trusting, that at least in the games that we put them through. But I think one other thing that we learned from that was that the prompts can make a big difference. So the system prompts that you use on AI can set a tone for it. The AI agents are remarkably flexible in how they react to different system prompts. So instead of just saying, you're a helpful AI assistant, how would you, what action would you recommend taking in this particular situation? I say, pretend you're an investment banker from New York, or I say, pretend you're a rural villager in Karnataka. It'll play completely differently. And it'll play completely differently in ways that are astoundingly similar to how an investment banker in New York plays versus how well, So we've been working with that, and you can match different populations using AI with these kinds of prompts. And it's amazing at how steerable it is to take on different personalities and to emulate different types of humans. So at least even a single AI agent is steerable in very different ways. It would be very difficult to tell a human, play like a rural villager in Karnataka. We would have no idea how that would play out. But AI has some, it's amassed enough information. It has an ability to do this. That's quite striking.
But you didn't find that the size of the model is itself a parameter that would actually induce specific behavior in those games?
Well, so I think, that it's hard right now that AI is evolving so rapidly. And we do see differences between free versions versus paid versions, and, steerability and how consistent it is. And I think part of it is, the more sophisticated AI, where you're using more energy to actually get it to answer a given question. There's a lot going on under the hood, and it seems to make a difference. And so part of this is not to say we're trying to test very specific instantiations of AI, but develop toolkits for being able to evaluate lots of different AI systems that we'll be experiencing going forward, and understanding how steerable they are and which ones are steerable, which ones aren't, to what extent are they helpful, and to what extent can they be harmful or amplify human tendencies. So those are kinds of questions that we can answer, and I think are more long-lived questions than which of these current LLMs are more cooperative or less, or more sophisticated or less.
So I was about to say, Anthropic, and I'm sure other companies will follow, hired a philosopher And they are read in the press, specialized, that some AI system may actually get depressed, right? Depending on how we interact with them. And if so, they perform not as good as they would if they were not depressed. So this is indeed a question you can't answer at tea time, right? This would necessarily imply like a temporal element in the study, potentially a challenge for all of us researchers to replicate those studies.
Yeah. And, I think one thing that's interesting about this is that, there's basic questions that we still don't understand about humans, which are what does consciousness mean? What does it mean to be aware of ourselves and our own decision making? Why do we have consciousness? How are we the same humans from moment to moment? And it could be that understanding AI systems and understanding their evolution will give us insights into that in ways that, it's hard to unpack in the human brain. Brain science is another of the 21st century, areas that's going to be a really important one. But this AI science is going to potentially help us understand a lot of questions as it continues to evolve.
Let me conclude the conversation with two questions. The first one, I guess, is more personal. So you've been an external faculty at the Santa Fe Institute for years, but you also have a foot in mainstream economics, however you want to call it, being a professor at Stanford, right? Is there a world in which those two will actually merge one day? And I guess, which is still the first question, do you think AI can actually play a role in that, right? By showing some economists that, well, you can now simulate more, and this is more complex than anticipated, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think my guess is that those two won't merge at some level. So I think that both paradigms are incredibly useful and they're very different. And so I have a bit of a split identity in some ways. So, and be thinking in different ways about different problems depending on where I am and who I'm talking to. Yeah. So I think being in SFI is extremely healthy and very mind opening in some ways. And most of the people that are attracted there have been incredibly open-minded, and its foundation to doing science that was outside of the mainstream was important. And I think it has a legacy and a history that puts it in a different plane than a lot of standard fields and departments. For whatever reason, we're sort of stuck with the silos that came out of the 18th and 19th centuries and even the 20th centuries. And they're very hard to sort of, break apart and steer. And to some extent, it's very useful to have a narrow paradigm. So if everyone's trained in the same textbooks, they can all speak each other's language. They can all communicate very easily. So it enables researchers to agglomerate in certain ways, but it has the same tendency that then we can have very different schools of thought, coexisting and not necessarily mingling as much as they should. Yeah. And, again, this gets back to our earlier points, right? AI could help facilitate more communication across these things, but it could also reinforce the learning within and the ability just to find other papers that really look like your paper and, say the same things and reinforce the beliefs that people have. So I'm guessing that both of these will play out over time. But I think, it's important that we have places like at Santa Fe Institute that, really have an open vision and allow people to come and communicate across disciplines and to brainstorm in ways that aren't going on inside the silos, the standard academic silos that exist.
Yeah. Have you ever been tempted to actually write a paper with no co-author, just saying, I'm going to look at this problem and deploy two completely different methods? One will be SFI friendly, the other one will be Stanford friendly, right? To call it this way.
Wow, I haven't thought of that, but it's a fascinating idea. I mean, and it's certainly, I can think of many problems where I could put on both of those persona.
Yeah.
And
not to show that one is better, right? But
no, exactly. But to show that they have very different perspectives and they might give different answers, but both provide useful insights to the same problem. Yeah. I mean, that would be sort of like an AI prompt myself thinking I'm a Santa Fe researcher, a Stanford Economics, and then see what happens. Yeah. I'll try that.
Stefan Zweig in the chess player. I don't know if you ever read that book, but he's actually stuck in jail at some point and he plays chess against himself and becomes really good at it for that reason.
That's a real talent.
Yeah. All right. Let me ask a final question. So, looking at scaling laws, is there across your work, and there are many things we have not covered. We talked a bit about finance. We didn't talk about supply chains. You've done work on that, friendships as well. Have you identified some basic scaling laws when it comes to social behaviors, or do you think that it's for now too complex to actually come up with something that could indeed be a power law that explains social networks?
No, I think really the one that struck me the most is that in looking at a lot of these systems, there's a number of people within networks community who've looked at community detection and sort of trying to figure out where the splits in a network are and what are the different groups that emerge within a network. And from an economist perspective, I see that playing out, having important implications in all sorts of settings. So it affects the job markets, it affects the information, it affects polarization of opinions, it affects the supply chain disruptions and whether they have contagions across continents. It affects the level of financial contagion and how that plays out in a system. So those divisions in the network turn out to be sort of important aspects to take into account in scaling. And then it means that, simple contagion systems don't necessarily give us the right answer. And when there's some kind of feedback, which happens in a lot of human systems, then we have to worry about these divisions, and they control where behaviors spread quickly and where they slow down. And I think that's sort of just an underlying principle. It doesn't give you a simple law, but it says that this is something you need to take into account in a lot of different processes that have some kind of reinforcement or internal reaction to them. And that plays out in many economic settings and many political settings, many social settings. So it's an important phenomenon.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that, I have to say it feels, finishing this conversation, that this is the first time that we actually come back to the roots of the very first episode of this podcast, in which we discussed indeed how scaling may mean that if you look at a city, for example, that you're going to have more patents, more opportunities, but also more crime. So not necessarily to associate scale with something that will be positive, as we tend to do, right? If you look at economic system where you would say a big company produce more wealth. So thank you very much for that, because it was a clear complement looking at more social dynamics than what we've done so far in the podcast. So I've learned a lot. I've put all the links to all the papers in the show notes. I'll also let you know when I make it to Palo Alto. So Matt, on that, thank you very much. And to everyone out there, take care of yourself. And if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Thibaut.